So let me introduce Rick to you. Again, as I said earlier, it's my pleasure to introduce Rick Rummler. Rick is Vice President of Process and Performance Management at Muve Health, which is a healthcare startup. And before this appointment, Rick was an industrial process engineer, an organizational performance architect with about 25 years of experience in coaching, training, and process improvement. Rick has utilized performance improvement concepts and tools espoused by his father, Dr. Gary A. Rummler, with organizations such as Cigna, Citibank, DuPont, and Hewlett-Packard. Rick's the co-author of the book entitled White Space Revisited, Creating Value Through Process. And we're especially glad to have Rick today speak about these concepts, since many of our students, you included, who were on the call, have used or are familiar with Dr. Rummler's 9-cell organization alignment model and his anatomy of performance concepts. So Rick's contact information will be on the last slide of his presentation, but again, he encourages you to do this. I'm sure he'll say the same thing by contacting him at rick@muve, M-U-V-E, muvehealth.com, muvehealth, one word.com. So I'm proud to introduce Rick Rummler, who's going to be speaking on the topic pros and cons of using performance improvement models and frameworks. Rick, it's all yours.
Very good. Well, thank you, Bud, and thank you, Steve, for having me. It's truly an honor to be here. It's interesting. I've had a chance to interface with a number of students from your program informally on a case-by-case basis as they've sought to get access to different materials and had questions, but it's great to be formally part of the program, so thank you again for the opportunity. I wanted to, when Bud first approached me about talking with the group, he mentioned that some were using the 9 performance variables table, and I thought, well, I'd like to expand it a little bit to talk about performance improvement models and frameworks, because there's always a little bit of a danger of falling in love with any one particular model or any one particular framework, but also to put that into context a little bit. So let's tell you a little bit about what I'm doing now, and then we can go from there. So I'm now working with Muve Health. Muve Health is a outpatient knee and hip replacement center, and with a specialized recovery arm. So the business model that we're working with is doing something that's very unique, which is what brought me out of my consulting background and into the healthcare industry, was finding somebody with a business model that was truly trying to align patients' best interests with providers' best interests with payers' best interests. Usually it's 2 of the 3, and it's a fairly antagonistic relationship, business relationship between the 3. We saw the opportunity to really align them in a unique way. So to give you a sense for how that uniqueness shows up, from the idea is that we're bundling our services and the associated fees. So instead of getting 11 bills after having a knee replaced or a hip replaced, you'd be getting 1 bill. And that's 1 bill to the patient, that's 1 interface with the provider, and that's 1 fee to the payer. And the interaction can typically be over a year. So we're able to provide all the services associated with that recovery for over a year, with 1 fixed price, with a warranty, or we're holding the bag on the risk of the quality of our services. So excited to be part of that. It's a very, very different approach to providing and managing and administering how healthcare services are provided. So excited to be part of that, but that is not where I started. Where I started, going way back, was the Praxis Corporation, which was started up by my father, Gary Rummler, and Tom Gilbert. Originally formed in concept in Michigan, moved to New York City, and then ultimately to New Jersey. I use the title Training Materials Administration, which is a glorified name for the kid in the basement who was stuffing binders, and occasionally read them. And I'll be the first to confess that most of my conversations with Tom Gilbert were about baseball as opposed to behavioral engineering. But we all have to start somewhere, And I've had a chance to interact with some really fantastic people at Praxis Corporation, and still keep in contact with quite a few of them. Thinking back at how that organization and the people there were really at the forefront of methods and tools for doing training needs analysis, and really driving the big part of the drive towards moving it from training needs to performance needs, and thus the name of this program having performance in it, and not being limited to training. So just exciting to see how it's come forward, and to be able to relate to its history as well as its future. 80s, I was with the Rummler group, and then 90s, Rummler Brache group. And it's interesting, in the 80s, the Rummler group was very much, our primary model was the organizations as systems model, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it was very much a holistic way of looking at organizations. In the 90s, when the Rummler Brache group came about, the book Improving Performance came out, and all of a sudden Gary Rummler became and Alan Brache, his partner, became process gurus. So all of a sudden we were the process people in the eyes of many. And so it was interesting how the thoughts didn't change, and the views of how organizations tick and don't tick didn't change, but the market kind of cast us in different ways. In 2001, I rejoined my father, who had retired unsuccessfully, and then formed Performance Design Lab, and continued to be a part of Performance Design Lab past his death in 2008, which kind of marked the midpoint in Performance Design Lab. And the three remaining partners kept Performance Design Lab going until last year, at which point I made the jump to healthcare, which was interesting because in the history here, I had the benefit, the blessing of being able to work with pretty much people in every part of organizations. So whether it be both executives as well as subject matter expert teams in every part of the organizations, from back office to sales to manufacturing to R&D, in pretty much every major industry. So it's great to have a varied background. And so now I've been able to bring that to Muve, but I'm also very thrilled to be able to sidelight a little bit and do some things with Steve and Bud as part of this program. So jumping into the content, or the focus of the presentation, it's performance improvement models and frameworks, which can sound a little bit nebulous, but that's okay. I first wanted to kind of back up and say, when I think about models and frameworks, they tend to fall into two big categories, or two types. One are models and frameworks that help us just understand what's going on. Why does that happen the way that it is? But also to predict it. If we made this change, what might the result be? So basically allowing us to make sense of the world, and their models and frameworks are very, very powerful to be able to do that. But there's another set, which are models and frameworks that really guide the actions that we take, and there's more of a sequence associated with it. So I for just kind of put some examples there. So understand and predict performance. That's where I would put Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, for example. It's he's trying to make sense of human performance and the variables that impact human performance with that model. Where something like ISPI's HPT model, for those who are familiar with it, I would put in the second category. It's more about what's the sequence of actions to bring about change, and with methods and tools associated with that. So a little different category, and it's important to make that distinction, because sometimes people try to take a model or framework that's particularly good in one category or for one type of use, and use it in the other, and because they really like that model or they really like that framework, and that's where we get into trouble. So that is one of the things that we need to recognize, both the strengths of the models and frameworks that we use, but also the limitations, in that it can be a challenge to use things beyond their intended purpose. And so it's good to always ask, what is the sweet spot or intended purpose? Now the key words here is performance improvement, and so that is at the end of the day why we're trying to deploy models and frameworks. So a little bit on that. I won't go deep on this, but I just want to give us a little bit of context in that, for me, when I think about performance improvement, the biggest challenge we're trying to face is finding the balance between what's the scope of the change and what's the results we're going to get with the change. And that is the $1,000,000 question. If I scope it too small, will I get significant results? If I scope it too big, is it too unmanageable and the time to getting results is too long? So some balance point factors. One is, what is the time window? What's the patience of the organization? So if I know that basically due to seasonality or due to changes in management or whatever the case may be, I've got X amount of time in which I've got to be able to get to a result. After that, it becomes questionable whether I'm going to be able to keep the focus and attention of the organization, and that's a huge factor. Next one is urgency, both perceived and real urgency need to be factored into that. What are the resources available? Your own time, as well as access to subject matter experts or access to other experts inside or outside the organization. And then there's always the question of sponsor or champion interest and commitment to what we're doing. Now, it's not an exhaustive list, but those tend to be some of the key things that come to mind first and foremost. And just pointing up that we never have the luxury of the perfect situation for doing performance improvement. We're always dealing with what are these trade-offs and finding the balance. And that can lead to different strategies for how we do things. And there's not necessarily a right strategy or a wrong strategy, but we need to have a strategy. And so it can be a daisy chain where we're going to take something that is a series of engagements and break them up into smaller engagements because we think we can get increments of results that will keep the attention of the organization. Or we can go basically go big or go home and tap momentum for change and really go after the notion of as Gary Rummler and Alan Brache would say, using the critical business issue to drive the understanding of the necessity for change and create momentum for putting that change in place. Or there's the whack-a-mole approach, which is very opportunistic. So I don't have the enough reputation or inside the organization to line up projects or engagements the way I'd like. So I'm just going to pick my spots and build a good reputation. And at some point, I may be able to take on a larger initiative with a higher visibility and tap momentum, or come up with a longer chain or longer plan or strategy like daisy chain. So again, just things we want to consider as part of doing performance improvement, and that it's generally not left to us to define how we want to do it. We're dealing with a situation and an organization in a particular super system or environment that we're trying to help it where it is get to where it wants to get to. So a lot of things come into play, but that's kind of the context for then talking about models and frameworks is how do we use those to help us address this balance question. So coming back to the two types, what I'd like to do in particular is focus on the first type, so understanding and predicting performance. Now, when I look at this set of models and frameworks, where I think their real strengths are is these three: defining and communicating the scope of engagements, analyzing and communicating current performance, and then looking at future performance. So they work very, very well in all three regards. What I always find incredibly helpful about using a visual model or a visual framework is being able to tap into the third word in each one of those bullet points, communicating. It's one thing to be able to use a model as a framework to guide our thought process and our approach to how we're going to go about trying to understand something or analyze or design something. But the other major benefit of a model and framework is it's something you can actually use to educate and inform other stakeholders. so that they're on board with how you're going to go about doing it. And it's amazing the difference it makes when you're doing it solo versus when you've got an understanding and an appreciation for the logic trail you want to follow with key stakeholders. If nothing else, with your champion or your sponsor for the effort, it's really good to avoid surprises, and models and frameworks are at least a way of being able to show that you have a plan or an overall logic, and that you're not making it up as you go along, which helps a lot with the trust factor of working with a sponsor or a champion. Again, that distinction, though, between the two types of models and frameworks, where we get into trouble is when we start using models and frameworks for that are designed for understanding and predicting performance for project planning, and that is a tendency. I just need to be careful not to cross that line. You could put for example, using Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, you could hang a sequence on that, and you could from that distill a implementation path, but that's not how it was intended to be used. So examples of understanding and predicting performance models and frameworks. So three that immediately come to mind because they're from the book Dr. Gary Rummler and Alan Brache wrote called Improving Performance, How to Manage the White Space on the Organization Chart. Human Performance System, 9 performance variables. And there's a set of models that are closely aligned: organization of system, anatomy of performance, and super system. And those are 3 that were incredibly well received by both those in our field, the performance improvement field, but also to our great pleasure by line managers who said, "Wow, you've actually created something. You gave me something I can use to help make sense of the world. I was looking for something, and this really did take what I was thinking and put it forward in an organized way, so I could use it as part of my work." So really thrilled that in particular those 3 models and frameworks were adopted both within our profession, but also by management at large. We didn't stop there. So in the follow-on book, White Space Revisited, that Gary Rummler, along with Alan Ramis and myself, wrote, there were other models and frameworks that we've gotten incredible utility from using: business process framework, value creation hierarchy, effective process framework. And I think this is a long way of saying there are many to choose from, and so it's important to get an understanding of a range of models and frameworks to understand what's the sweet spot of each, and not be limited to one that you've historically used or had success with. But then the world does not revolve around just Rummler work. So there's other great models and frameworks out there. So we've mentioned Gilbert's behavior engineering model, Weisbord's 6-box model, a process maturity model, APQC framework, the SCORE reference model, MIT business activity model. So many great ones out there, and encourage you to just be a student of what those models are and what they can do and how you might bring them to bear. Personal experience is that they're best used in combination. Their sweet spots tend to be quite different, but they can be complementary. So the one in particular that I wanted to use is to talk about the value of models and frameworks is the 9 performance variables. Bud had mentioned that there was some experience using it, so I was excited to be able to both talk about how it works as a model and framework, but also specifically share experience in using that model myself. And it's interesting, in the book Improving Performance, where it was first published, there was no description of how to use it. It was a great framework for organizing the content that was in the book, but there's not an applied logic sequence for how you would deploy it. So I'm excited to be able to actually talk about that a little bit for the first time with this group and get your experience as well. Now, if I kind of pull apart this model, there's 2 axes. The first axis is is the performance levels: organization, process, and job. And let's see, kind of taking them top to bottom. So organization, the key thing to keep in mind when looking at organization is the term organization is relative. So this could be a department, it could be a store, could be a operating unit, it can be a strategic business unit, it can be an entire corporation. So the notion of organization is relative, but the more tightly or narrowly we define organization, the less value we get out of it, because it's all about understanding the larger context and the variables that are impacting the performance that we're trying to impact. Next level is process, and we've learned a lot about process, even since 1995, or actually the first edition of Improving Performance was 1990, and so we've gained so much understanding of that. So now when we think about process, it's not arbitrary. It's not how people want to define what their workflow is. Now, processes really, think of it as the chain of value-producing work units. And no individual defines what the process is. We are all part of creating value within an organization. And that string of value is only achieved by lots of different components. And so it takes multiple capabilities to generate value for the organization. And the key thing is that where does the definition of value come from? It's the organization level, because there's got to be some elements of strategy or plan for how we're trying to go forward. And then lastly is the job level. So, and that can be an individual, can be a team, can be a class of performers, can be an individual performer or a person. So any combination can be at the job level. So let me just hit this, and I see we've got a question, so we'll grab that. So at the three levels, any one of the three levels is a systemic way of looking at the organization. And so you have the ability to look at the organization as a system, as the process as a system, or the human performance system, which is one of the models that we use. But at the same time, they're also very much interdependent, and none of those levels can exist unto themselves or independent of the others around it. Alan Brache used to refer to the process level as being no more important than organization or job. It's just that it happens to be the meat in the sandwich. So it's the joining of the two pieces of bread, the organization and job. In combination, this is a very holistic way of looking at and understanding performance, and I think that's the real value of it, is that it gives you a broad view. Think of it as the wide-angle lens that you might first use to understand the larger context before you start diving in. Steve, Bud, is there a question that we want to take on here?
I just posted a comment, and if others have questions, I hope they ask them. But the comment I made was a very important point that you made about the scope of this model. So, you said that the more narrow the focus of the model is, as you move from a wide organization to a department to something to a smaller entity, you kind of lose the power of the model a little bit. I think that's kind of what I heard you say. Is that on target?
Well, look for. I'll come up to a natural bridge for asking questions, but I'll be curious to get a sense for everybody's use and understanding of the three levels of performance, which has been around for a while. Very, very powerful way of looking at performance. That's really been a huge influence on my thinking.
Yeah, Rick, can you see Steve's question?
Yes.
How common is it to find organizations that have aligned vertically and horizontally?
It's interesting in that. When it comes to finding and assigning managers in organizations, it's from an organization perspective, it's very easy to see who has managerial or oversight responsibility at the organization level, and typically it's required that we have it, just because you've got hiring managers and you've got somebody who's got to do performance appraisals, and so there typically is a named manager or managers at the job performer level. The challenge from an alignment perspective is that because processes are cross-functional in their nature, they tend not to be well managed. So it creates a an immediate source of potential misalignment. As a matter of fact, it tends to be our assumption is that we assume misalignment until proven otherwise. And so if the question is where is that misalignment, because organizations in particular don't have despite all the discussion of process owners and process management, there really isn't a largely held understanding of how to effectively manage processes in organizations. So we expect there's going to be some level of misalignment between organization and process and job and process that's going to keep us from going top to bottom. And then the other part is jumping ahead. Let's see if I can do this. Here we go. Is on the performance needs. Here it's the goals and the design and the management, and we tend to look at it as, well, that's goodness, right? That there should be clear goals and there should be a clear design and there should be management that closes the loop on that and assures that we're a guided missile as opposed to an unguided missile when it comes to performance. And here it's really looking at, are we effective? So do the goals lay out what is effective, and do we have a design that allows us to be effective, and are we managing to ensure that we are effective? And that happens at each level. And what I always find interesting is, in this model, there's a question you can ask in each part of the table, but there's a lot of underlying theory that goes into what can be a pretty simplistic looking model. In that you have to remember that Rick Rummler and Alan Brache were influenced by a lot of work doing needs analysis, and so they recognize that if there are effective goals is one of the key areas we look for. The most common barriers to effective performance at any level is going to be, is there clear understanding of what's expected? So that became one of the key focus areas here. And then, is there a design for doing it? And then, is there anybody who's tracking to see whether those goals are achieved? So basically, there are a lot more detailed models that can go deep at any one of these levels. But the real value here is being able to see it in a holistic way, to understand where are the issues and opportunities, and then that might then tee up, what are other models and tools that would help me go deeper in this level or in this area now that I have an appreciation for where that opportunity is. Because initially we want to go in not making assumptions that the scope is narrow. No matter how nicely and tightly defined it is by the requester or however it's been communicated to us, we have to assume that the variables that impact the ability to improve performance could be anywhere in that performance system. And what we don't want to do is to be blind to it, and we don't want to be surprised by it. So as much as we get people will like to say that I want you to stay in this box and you don't need to do anything outside of that, at the end of the day, if something happens that undermines our ability to get the result, even if we can't control that, if we didn't see that and didn't raise that, we don't get thanked for that later, that we did a nice job of staying inside our box. We will share in the negative feedback that it didn't have the desired result. So it's in our best interest to look for ways of stepping outside without causing problems and asking questions. Because really, stepping through this model is really just a matter of asking questions. And then, speaking of questions, so the full version of the model that appears in Improving Performance has a series of questions that can be asked in each one of the cells. I won't go through them all here, but the idea being is there is a natural questioning sequence. And so using this to ask questions about levels that you might not necessarily see as part of your scope or as part of the need, it can be a matter of just simply asking for permission to go ask a couple questions. So informally, just gauging, it's kind of pushing on the other the other cells to say, is this solid or is this not solid? So is there any sense of what the process goals may be that this job is part of? And is there any sense from an organizational standpoint what might be the strategy for carrying out this set of work? So I want to always make sure I'm working from a solid foundation before I start in any one place. So what I like about this is the holistic nature of it. You know, it's interesting. I've been using those two dimensions for so long that I don't ever actually look at the table. It's just a part of the thought process that I've adopted. Is okay. Where is that need? Where does it show up? And then where does that take me as a logical path for being able to validate it and understand if that's the full scope of what I need to address to be able to get to that result. But coming back to the finding the balance between scope and results, you know, you may not be able to address going all the way through this, even if you find that everything needs to be affected in order to get to the result. It may not be within your purview to make that the scope of what your effort is. So you start in one area, but with the idea that you set the expectation that, you know, I'd like to have the opportunity to move into the next area after you've built some credibility and a reputation in a particular area. It can be quite useful. So questions at all about the 9 performance variables and models and frameworks? I'll kind of pause here and test for questions, and then I'll run you through a couple scenarios for how we've actually used this.
One of the things that I always found helpful, this is Steve, in Gary's work was the idea that, you know, a lot of times when we first hear about performance gaps, they would be phrased in terms of job and performer level stuff. And I remember his guidance to say, you know, if you can move job and performer level stuff to the process level, you're going to be making a bigger change and producing better results and potentially happier clients. And if you can move from the process to the organization level, you can make even greater improvements. And I've always found that advice really helpful. I think all too often we tend to somewhat get trapped at that job and performer level to the exclusion of the higher levels.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, the notion of blind spots, you know, we all suffer from them, and I think that the value of having something like this, that it causes us to, you know, we'll make assumptions about, oh, that's probably not an issue or probably not a need area, but you know what, I should ask that question. You know, I shouldn't assume that all is good, because and it's, you ask that question, and it's amazing the things you find out when you're willing to ask that question and take it. Consider going to another level or going to another part of the model. So I'll run through some scenarios, and we can revisit again how it might be applied. But, you know, when I started looking at my experience for how we've applied 9 performance variables, so, you know, a lot of Steve, as you mentioned, a lot of the needs that come to us or issues or opportunities are couched as a so-and-so or these people. So there's a person or a set of people at the root of the issue or opportunity, whether it be customer service reps, whether it be sales reps, whether it be whole project teams. It can be, you know, oftentimes that's where we get asked to help out. And so where I always want to go when people say, hey, you know, it's about the person. Well, at first I want to understand, okay, what is the intended goal of that person or set of people? But then that's just for my baseline. Where I want to quickly go from that is, okay, is there a correlation between those job goals and process goals, and then going up to, are there organization goals that are relevant? And this can be critical because there are times it's amazing how you find out that the reason why this thing is happening that you can't necessarily explain is, as it turns out, is because of a metric that's on a scoreboard at the organization level that is causing managers to skew performance in a way to make sure that the scorecard looks good, but ultimately causes for either conflicting or just illogical guidance to individuals in the organizations. And then going to the right, once I understand what the job goals are, then I want to understand, well, is there a design that supports it? And when you get to the design column, it's interesting in that I guess the best example is the organization design. So every organization has a strategy. It may not be written, but there's a default strategy, and it can be a confused strategy too. But the idea is there's a logic for why things are done the way they are, and so we need to understand what that logic is. And so the design is both current as well as future or ideal. So we want to understand, once we know what the job goals are, is there a job design that's aligned to what those goals are? And then once I understand that, I want to bump it up to, does that align with the process that job is part of, or processes, because oftentimes we support more than one process in an organization. And then there's their correlation to organization design. I want to understand the alignment of the design before I go then say, okay, now that I understand the goals and the design, then how are we going to manage with that in mind? I'm typically going to look at how I manage the sequence of activities before I look at how I best manage this individual or role within that string of activities. So that's kind of the logic trail that I would use in terms of understanding a need or opportunity. But it also feeds into how I go about analyzing as well as designing. Now, alternatively, the issue or opportunity can be process in nature. So we're trying to address product development. And so again, it may be couched as a people issue or opportunity, but with even just a couple questions up front, they go, well, really the issue is we're not getting products out on time. So yeah, so I'm talking about the product manager, but the reality is it's about product development. Or I'm talking about training managers, but it's about new hire time to productivity is the issue or opportunity I'm trying to deal with. Or one that I have in front of me right now is scheduling tours for our new facility, which we'll have our first case week after next. And so trying to make sure we have an organized way for doing that. So I'll start with what are the goals we have for that process, and to what extent that aligns with the organization goals, and is there a design that supports achieving those goals? And then once I understand if there's a process design and whether that makes sense, then I'll see whether the organization design is going to be affected by that and whether the job designs need to be adjusted based upon the process design. And then that'll take me to, okay, if that's what the desired job design is, then what are the desired job goals that will make that happen, before looking then at the management side of the equation, starting with process, the flow of value that I want to create, and then what's required from an organization standpoint and from a job standpoint to be able to support that.
Rick, Chet has made a comment you might want to comment on. You can see it in your chat box where Chet said, I found politics to be one of the biggest barriers to successful alignment.
No doubt.
Have you experienced or you have?
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that?
Well, and that's where there's so many, the politics get in the way of us looking at it as a total system. And so we know, especially at the organization level, things tend to be divvied up. So you've got budgets that control different aspects of the organization level. So that's where we start really bumping into the politics, is where we start getting into the organization level. You tend to have less politics at the job performer and process level. And what I've always found very, very powerful about process level, it tends to be can be the politics buster, because there's a logical sequence of work that creates value for organizations. So if I can get people to buy into, don't you agree this is the result that we collectively want to be able to get to? How can I engage you and your team and your resources to help get to that? So sometimes we've done that using the notion of the critical business issue to elevate the the issue or opportunity, the significance of it, and the potential result for it, so that people don't want to get in the way of it. But also, people tend to want to be associated with those things that they know are going to be successful, and they tend to be pretty good about undermining those things that they don't think are going to be successful. So how do you then create enough stakeholder alignment so that this is viewed as something that they want to be associated with, and then the politics can go away, or if you don't do it well, politics will get harder. So it's interesting. There's a natural survival instinct that people in organizations have, which is comes right out of the human performance system, right? We aspire to be involved in those things that lead to positive consequences, and we don't have a desire to be associated with those things that lead to negative consequences. So in some ways, though, using the politics sensing the politics and whether the politics is for you or against you is a very good indicator of whether you're going in the right direction. Because if the politics are standing in your way, then it may mean that you're not approaching this in a way that best allows you to see what the opportunity is, which means you're not able to help them see how best to understand the opportunity. Now, there is a point at which politics becomes just plain counterintuitive and illogical, and so I can't say that it's we can always address it, but I've had incredible success using models and frameworks like this to bring on board people who were really strong skeptics and really adverse from a political standpoint, because you can use this to say, hey, I've got no agenda. I'm just trying to understand what's going on, and here's the framework I'm using. I don't have a desire to affect your part of the organization. I'm not trying to cause anything in particular to happen. So it's I've always found models and frameworks to be a very good way of stressing that my affiliation is Switzerland, and I have no vested interest in what the result is other than improving performance. So great question, because that's just a harsh reality that's always there, especially when you get into the kinds of issues and opportunities that pop up at the organization level. So we've actually seen this model used for really big issues opportunities that affected whole organizations. Motorola used this framework for designing their factory of future. I don't know if you saw a number of years ago, there was a great presentation at ISPI where they actually used this model to redefine and really relaunch the Dutch Olympic swim team, and their entire program was organized around this model. Really some great work, and encourage you to seek that paper out. And I think there was a video of their presentation that was very, very powerful. And if you have trouble finding it, let me know. I'm sure I can find it. But even for developing a scorecard for a particular unit of the organization, you can still use this as a way of understanding it, because a scorecard just lays out what are the goals of the organization, but if it's not linked, if it's not tied to the reality of how the organization performs, then it's just that. It's an empty scorecard. So ultimately, we need to make sure that the wiring behind that scorecard is good, which means wiring down to the process goals, and then ultimately making sure there's a process design that can generate the results associated with those goals, and then making sure the organization design and job design fit with that, and ultimately job goals, before then looking at the management side. So ultimately, I just find it to be a very good sanity check in terms of understanding anything that gets thrown at me, whether it be at the job level, at the process level, the organization level, and again, as I talked earlier, in trying to find that right balance point between results and scope. We're always dealing with less than ideal situations, and politics being a part of that. But at least you need to start with a clean logic, and to be able to explain the logic for how you are thinking about it, want to look at it, and try to bring others on board with it. So you start with a sound plan, and then go forward, and then there's plenty of opportunities as you start seeing where the where the real need, where the greatest need or opportunity is, whether it be specifically the biggest holes are at the job level, or the biggest holes are at the process level, or at the organization levels, is to then bring other models and frameworks to bear that help you get into greater level of detail that's appropriate for that level and also for that area of need, whether it be goal setting or design or management. So I've just always found this to be a very powerful way of being able to organize the thinking, and it's just been a key survival mechanism for me, and I hope it will be for you. So some questions that I'd put out there in advance that we can spend time on, or happy to jump to any question you guys have in particular. But are the benefits of using models such as nine performance variables model. I find it to be very, very helpful for scoping and then communicating what that scope is, that there's a logic for it. Are there pitfalls, though, is recognizing that every model has a sweet spot, and so they're not all the same in the intent, but also helps you kind of really understand, okay, what the full scope of the need may be, and then how do you adjust to that or react to that. So more thoughts on any of those questions or any other question you have? I would love to hear you either now or in follow-up.
Rick, could you go back to your previous slide for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely.
In the case of the factory of the future design, would it be fair to say that this 9-cell model was actually used more as a planning tool than a performance assessment tool? In other words, did Motorola use this not so much to assess where it was now, or although I suppose it could have been used as a is and should be, framework too, but just how did they use it? I guess what I'm asking, was it used as kind of a planning framework?
Yeah, absolutely. A great question. So, once they understood what were the goals of the factory of the future as overall, where they quickly stepped down to was what are the key processes that will power or comprise that factory of the future, and then for each process they said what are the design specs. So what does that process have to be able to achieve to meet our overall organizational goals. So it was a taking a larger goal, breaking it into sub-goals, but a lot of it wasn't just the goal, but it was also what they had as key parameters for how those processes were going to be performed. And a lot of that has to do, we're informed by their understanding of the current situation without doing a lot of analysis. So they had basically design specs that they used to frame all the thinking, and the value was thinking about it all the way through. So the design specs for the goals, for what has to be the result, design specs for how we're going to do it, so what we're going to achieve with it being the goals, how we're going to do it being the design, and then what does that say in terms of how we're going to go about managing it, which starts getting into the structure that we're going to put around this system that we're building over in management. So they had design specs for all. There wasn't they were operating factories now, so they knew the kinds of issues they wanted to avoid, and that informed their thinking, though, without necessarily needing to have an analysis phase.
Okay, good, thanks. And by the way, just in the interest of time, we have about 5 minutes left. And Rick, I think you mentioned earlier, folks who have questions that aren't necessarily addressed here or come up, can they communicate those to you? Because I'm sure there will be some questions people would like to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Pat has one. Maybe we can get to it. Can you say it in the chat box? How do you evaluate the answers to some of your questions in the 9 performance variables model, such as has the organization's strategy been articulated and communicated? Do you use rubrics or just draw on your own experience? How do you use those questions?
Yeah, usually I'll go to the people who understand the performance that we're looking to achieve the best, and say, what do you not know that you need to know? So especially when it comes to strategy, because strategy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and most strategies are on the skinny side. Really, it's about do we have the guidance we need to be able to effectively operate? And so this is where it's helpful to really nail it to what's the specific result we're trying to get at. So relative to that result, so looking at it from the link between process goal and organization goal, relative to the process result we're trying to get, what do I need to get from the organization strategy to be able to effectively guide that process result? So try to narrow the scope down to what are the specific things, and then you can nail down what then are the implications. If I don't get that guidance, what's the impact? And what's good enough guidance versus ideal guidance? And basically you're able to bring it back as a little bit of a logic question to the organization management, saying you want this result. You obviously see there's a correlation between getting that result and having this kind of guidance coming from the organization level. And once you've got them bought into what that logic is, they can connect the dots. And that's what is most powerful, is when you're teeing up the conversation and the wheels are turning for them, because frankly, they tend to understand. I'm typically not the subject matter expert in the room. They tend to understand the connection between what needs to be in place from guidance to get the result better than I do. All we're doing is giving them a framework where they can see that I've got two dots that aren't connected, and if I've got the right people in the room kind of facilitating a discussion about what's the level of guidance we need to be able to provide to be able to get that result. So we're all prone to wishful thinking, unless somebody says there is a logic gap that exists that we have to close in order to get that result. And people I've found to be very open to having that discussion and trying to bridge that, but sometimes you have to make it, you have to serve that up for them in a way that they can see the need to address it.
Good, thanks, Rick. I think we have time for one more. John's posted the question. I'd love to hear something more tactical or performer level. How about your experience using the HPS human?
Yeah, the human performance system is remember I just did training for our new location last week, and the human performance system as a way of showing the systemic nature of human performance and the impact there. Let's see if I can get back to. There we go. I mean, the key thing for troubleshooting using the human performance system for me is, always starting with that variable, what is the desired output? The lack of clarity around what the output we have for people is the biggest thing that undermines the performance of individuals. So I love the human performance system that it points out that it's a system, and that there are multiple variables that are going to impact getting the result. Now, there are some that we know have greater leverage and some that have lesser leverage, but they all have leverage. And so we can't just fix one variable and expect to get the result. So that's what I love about it, and so many of others' work have supported that, from Dr. Deming, and that usually there's no one silver bullet that's gonna fix the problem. And I love the human performance system to be able to articulate that and show that, and people go, oh yeah, so just doing more training isn't going to solve this problem, is it? Nope. Not when I've got multiple variables that are being that have significant gaps associated with them. So to think that I can take one variable out and fix it and put it back in and expect the rest of the human performance system to work better is they quickly realize this wishful thinking, but we have to make that case to them. So I love the idea of being able to display the fact that there are multiple variables, and it's usually more than one at work that's impacting that, and some are more debilitating than others. And so we can then use the human performance system as a framework for bringing back our analysis, as well as a framework for bringing back what our design is for because people want to cherry pick and say, well, how about we just do this and this? It gives you a way to be able to bring back to really, look at this logically as a system. If we just change this and just change that and don't change this and this, is that going to work? And usually they answer their own question, and that's where it's most powerful, right? It's not us lecturing them on what's required to get the performance. They know it, but they'd like to think that there's an easier way to do it. Just do one thing, and as my father was prone to say, just stop asking if there's one thing you can do, is stop asking what the one thing you can do is, because there's seldom one thing that's going to get us the result we want to get to.
Let me, first of all, thank you so much for providing this. I mean, this is fascinating. It's generated some questions in my own mind. So at the very least, you'll probably hear from me for some things I'd like to follow up on with you. Yeah, so I echo Julie's comment. Thank you so very much, Rick. And again, feel free to follow up with Rick if you have follow-up questions. And this was extremely informative, Rick. Again, appreciate it very much. And we will stay in touch for sure.
My pleasure, and greatly looking forward to it. And thanks for your time. And again, definitely encourage you to reach out. Always a pleasure talking with others who are in the trenches.
Well, have a good day and a good week.
Well, thank you. You too.
Thank you.